There is something most people will never understand about the truly powerful. It is not their ambition, it is not their talent, it is not their connections or their resources or their relentless hustle. It is something far quieter, something that happens in the unseen hours, in the unspoken decisions, in the invisible architecture of how they think. Most people are performing their lives out loud, and the ones who are actually building something extraordinary, they have gone silent. Not quiet in the way of passivity or defeat, but silent in the way of stone, of depth, of a river that cuts through rock not by force, but by persistence and direction. What you are about to hear is the strategy that the ancient Stoics practiced, that history's greatest minds employed, and that the modern world has almost completely forgotten. Pay close attention, because once you see it, you will never be able to unsee it. We live in an age of radical noise, not just the noise of traffic and technology and social media, but the internal noise of anxiety, comparison, self-doubt, and the desperate need for external validation. People announce their goals before they've taken a single step toward them. They broadcast their struggles in real time, seeking sympathy instead of solutions. They measure their progress by likes and comments and reactions, by how many people saw them rather than how much they actually moved. And in doing so, they leak their energy into the atmosphere. They scatter their power like seeds thrown into the wind. Nothing takes root. Nothing grows deep. The Stoics understood something profound about the nature of power in human psychology. Marcus Aurelius, who ruled the most powerful empire on earth, kept his philosophy in a private journal, what we now call the Meditations. He never published it. He never announced his intentions. He never performed his virtue for an audience. He wrote those words to himself, as a private discipline, as a silent reckoning with his own character. And here is what is extraordinary. He was emperor. He had every reason and every opportunity to broadcast his wisdom, to build a legacy in his own lifetime. Instead, he turned inward, because he understood that the real work, the real strategy, is never meant for the crowd. This is the silent strategy, and it begins with a single ancient principle, that the quality of your inner life determines the quality of your outer results. Not eventually, not sometimes, always. Think about the way a tree grows. For the first several years, a strong tree is doing almost nothing visible above ground. It is pushing roots downward, deep into the earth, reaching toward water, anchoring itself against storms that have not yet arrived. If you judge that tree by what you saw above ground, you might think it was failing. You might lose patience. You might uproot it and plant something faster. But the tree does not care what you think. The tree is following a law deeper than opinion, a law that says structure must precede height, that what is built in silence is what survives. Seneca wrote, "It is not that I am brave, it is that I know what is worth fearing." This is a line that opens a door into one of the most misunderstood aspects of Stoic philosophy. Most people spend enormous energy fearing the wrong things. They fear what other people think. They fear failure as an event, as a public embarrassment, as something to be avoided at almost any cost. And in fearing these things, they make decisions not from strategy, but from panic. They chase noise because silence feels like irrelevance. They keep moving because stillness feels like death. But Seneca was pointing at something precise. The courageous person is not the one who fears nothing. It is the one who has learned to distinguish between what actually threatens their core and what is merely threatening to their ego. Your ego wants to be seen. Your ego wants credit. Your ego wants the world to know what you're building before you've built it. And here is the brutal truth. Feeding your ego before you've done the work is like eating the seed before planting it. There is nothing left to grow from. Every time you announce a goal without a plan, every time you seek praise for effort rather than result, you are consuming the very fuel you needed for the journey. The silent strategy requires that you develop what the Stoics called self-command, the ability to govern yourself so completely that you no longer need the world's reaction to know where you stand. Let me give you a real example. Consider two people starting a new endeavor, a business, a creative project, a physical transformation, anything that requires sustained effort over time. The first person talks about it constantly. They share their progress on social media. They tell everyone they know. They feel good when people respond positively. They feel deflated when no one notices. Their motivation is tied, invisibly but powerfully, to external feedback. When the feedback dries up, so does the drive. They eventually stall out, not because the goal was wrong, but because the fuel source was never theirs to begin with. The second person says almost nothing. They build in private. They track their progress internally. They develop what psychologists now call intrinsic motivation, a drive that comes not from what others see, but from who they are becoming in the process. When obstacles arrive, and they always arrive, this person does not spiral into public performance of their struggle. They sit with it, they analyze it, they adapt, and they keep moving. 6 months, a year, 2 years later, when the results become undeniable, people around them will say, "Where did this come from? This seemed to happen overnight." It did not happen overnight. It happened in silence. Epictetus, who began his life as a slave and became one of the most influential philosophers in history, taught one of the most clarifying distinctions ever articulated: the dichotomy of control. "Some things are in our control," he wrote, "and others are not. In our control are opinion, motivation, desire, aversion, and, in a word, whatever is of our own doing. Not in our control are our body, our reputation, command, and, in one word, whatever is not of our own doing." This is not a passive philosophy. This is a razor-sharp framework for where to invest your energy. The silent strategy is, at its core, the art of directing your full attention and effort toward what is within your control, and releasing, without resentment or regret, everything that is not. What does this look like practically? It looks like doing excellent work without waiting for anyone to notice. It looks like continuing when the environment gives you no confirmation that you're on the right path. It looks like building your skills in the hours that no one observes, in the mornings before the world wakes up, in the evenings after everyone else has checked out. It looks like resisting the modern compulsion to document your journey in real time, and instead trusting the process enough to let results speak when they are ready. And it looks like developing an inner compass so calibrated, so clear, that you do not need the crowd's compass to know which direction is north. There is a phenomenon in psychology called the social substitution effect. Research shows that when people talk about their goals publicly and receive positive feedback, the brain experiences a degree of the satisfaction that would normally come from actually achieving the goal. In other words, talking about what you plan to do gives you a neurological hit that can actually reduce your motivation to do it, because some part of your system registers it as partially accomplished. The Stoics did not have neuroscience, but they had something better: centuries of observed human behavior, and they saw this pattern clearly. Marcus Aurelius warned himself repeatedly in his private journal against seeking applause, not because applause is wrong, but because seeking it corrupts the quality of the action. When you work for applause, you begin to optimize for appearance rather than substance. You begin to make decisions based on what looks good rather than what is true. And slowly, without noticing, you become a performance rather than a person. The silent strategy also demands something most people find genuinely difficult: sitting with discomfort without explanation. When you are building something real, there will be periods, sometimes long periods, when nothing is working visibly, when results are not arriving on schedule, when the gap between where you are and where you want to be feels humiliating. In those moments, the temptation is to explain yourself, to justify your position, to tell people why you're still struggling, why it hasn't worked yet, why your situation is complicated. And again, every word of explanation is energy redirected away from the solution. The Stoics practiced what they called endurance without complaint. Not stoic in the colloquial, emotionally repressed sense, but deliberate, dignified persistence that refuses to spend its strength on performance. Consider the great builders, the ones whose names carry weight across time. Lincoln, who spent decades in public failure before his presidency. Edison, who ran thousands of failed experiments without public announcement of each. Beethoven, who composed some of his greatest symphonies after becoming deaf, working in a silence that was not chosen, but was transformed into something transcendent. What they shared was not genius alone. It was the capacity to work without constant external validation, to trust something internal enough to keep going when everything external said stop. Seneca wrote in one of his letters, "Retire into yourself as much as you can. Associate with those who will make a better man of you." This is one of the most practical pieces of advice in the history of philosophy, and it has never been more relevant than it is right now in 2026. The architecture of the modern world is designed with extraordinary precision to pull your attention outward. Every notification, every feed, every platform is built to keep your eyes on what other people are doing, to generate comparison, to trigger reaction, to keep you in a state of perpetual outward orientation. And in that state, the deep work of self-development becomes nearly impossible. Not because you're weak, but because the system is working exactly as designed. The silent strategy is, in part, an act of rebellion against that system. But rebellion without discipline is just another form of noise. The real practice is this. Every single day you carve out time, even 30 minutes, even 15, where you are completely unreachable, untrackable, unperformable. Where you sit with your own thoughts long enough to hear what they are actually saying. Where you examine your actions against your values, not against your image. Where you ask yourself not, did I look good today? But did I act well today? This is the inner audit. This is what Marcus Aurelius was doing in those private pages. He was not writing for posterity, he was writing for accountability, holding himself to a standard that required no audience, because the standard itself was the point. And here is where the silent strategy becomes genuinely transformative, not just as a productivity technique, but as a way of being. When you stop needing external validation to feel worthy, something shifts at a fundamental level. You stop competing with people who are on entirely different roads. You stop shrinking yourself to fit other people's comfort. You stop leaking your energy into every reaction and response and relational performance, and you start to feel, perhaps for the first time, the weight of your own full presence. Your choices become cleaner. Your focus becomes sharper. Your work becomes denser, more intentional, more alive. Because you are finally doing it for the only reason that ever produces anything worth having. Because it is true, because it is right, because it is yours. This does not mean isolation. It does not mean coldness or indifference to human connection. The Stoics were deeply relational people. Marcus Aurelius governed millions. Seneca was a counselor to emperors. Epictetus taught hundreds of students. The silent strategy is not about withdrawing from life. It is about withdrawing from the performance of life. There is a profound difference between being present in a relationship and performing your presence for an audience. Between doing your work and performing your work ethic. Between having values and performing your values. The silence strips away the performance and leaves the substance. And that substance, when it shows up in the world, carries a weight and credibility that no amount of performance ever could. There is one final dimension of the silent strategy that is perhaps the most important and the most difficult. It is the practice of not justifying yourself when you are right. This is extraordinarily hard for most people. When you know you are correct, when you have thought deeply about something, tested it against reality, refined your position, and someone challenges you or dismisses you or misunderstands you, every instinct screams to explain, to defend, to convince. And sometimes that is appropriate. But the Stoics understood that a constant need to justify yourself is a sign of insecurity, not strength. The person who is deeply rooted in their own understanding does not require every observer to share that understanding. They speak when speech is useful. They act when action is required. And when neither is necessary, they remain in that quiet, grounded confidence that requires nothing from the outside world to sustain itself. Marcus Aurelius wrote in his Meditations, "You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength." Not comfort, not ease, strength. The distinction matters enormously. The silent strategy does not promise you a peaceful life. It promises you a powerful one, a life where the storms that come, and they will come, do not determine your direction because your direction was never dependent on the weather. A life where what other people do or say or think about you occupies its correct and limited space, rather than the enormous distorting space that ego so readily assigns it. A life built from the inside out, where the foundation is so solid that what stands above it can afford to be simple, honest, and real. So here's the question you need to sit with tonight. Not perform an answer to, not post about, not discuss at length with anyone who doesn't need to hear it. Just sit with it, privately, in the silence that is yours alone. The question is this: how much of what you do every day are you doing for the work itself, and how much are you doing for what the work looks like to others? There is no judgment in this question, only information. And if your answer reveals more performance than presence, more audience than action, then you already know what the next step is. Not a dramatic announcement, not a public declaration of change, just a quiet turning inward, a deliberate, invisible, patient beginning. The roots going down before the tree goes up. The strategy no one sees until it has already won. That is the silent strategy, ancient, proven, and more urgently needed now than perhaps ever before. Not because the world has gotten louder, though it has, but because the soul that can hold its own silence in a world that profits from your noise is a soul that has found something genuinely rare, something the Stoics spent their lives seeking and protecting. Not fame, not power, not the approval of crowds, just the unshakable clarity of a person who knows who they are, does the work that is theirs to do, and lets the results arrive in their own time, inevitable, unhurried, and entirely real.